Hello everybody, how are you doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel, and today we are going to continue to revisit everybody's favorite topic that no one gets sick of, the idea of a Nintendo Switch 2. Now, one of the main reasons I felt like I wanted to discuss this a little bit further is the fact that it's now been a couple of weeks since Nintendo announced that they're delaying The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 until spring of next year. That's their current target release date. I and many people think that there's still a great chance that that date moves around and that it might get delayed one more time. But as of now, that is the date that they're telling us. That's the window that they're giving us, spring next year. And like I said, it's been a couple of weeks since that delay, and with that delay, a lot of people, as I mentioned on my own video when that happened, had started to kind of finally jump a little bit more on board with the idea that maybe this delay was a sign that Nintendo was already thinking about and preparing for the reveal or release of new hardware. A Switch 2, a next generation console, even like a crazy powerful Switch Pro thing, or just anything that's new hardware that would coincide with the release of Breath of the Wild 2 or be something that Nintendo could use to kind of bolster the hype, right? Like, Breath of the Wild 2 bolsters the hype of a Switch 2, and a Switch 2 could bolster the hype of a Breath of the Wild 2, and that whole kind of relationship could be a benefit that Nintendo is already starting to prepare for. And because I myself have been already kind of predicting a 2022 or 23 release or reveal for the next generation Switch or Nintendo console, I obviously found it pretty interesting that with the delay of Zelda, we started to see a huge amount of people finally start to kind of see this as a possibility. And so I found it interesting. I discussed it on my own video. But I think the reason I wanted to make another kind of follow-up discussion about this today is because, like I mentioned, even though that happened a few weeks ago, we're still kind of seeing a lot of people constantly talk about it. We're seeing a lot of people find excuses to say that a rumor or leak or something is going on out there, or finding reasons to talk about it on Twitter or on YouTube. And basically, it's just that Switch 2 conversation is still kind of continuing from people who aren't me, right? And I find it interesting just because, as you guys know, for 2 years I've already been talking about it happening in this specific window of time. And so as people continue to talk about it, and the delay of Zelda just influenced so many people to see this as a possibility, I wanted to kind of discuss more today in this video why it's such an interesting topic and an interesting idea for so many people, obviously myself included, right? Because I've been talking about it for 2 years. And why, in the wake of the delay of Zelda, so many people on YouTube and Twitter and everywhere continue to talk about it or get excited about it or even get upset about it. Plenty of people are upset about the fact that the idea is even being thrown around out there, which I find a little bit strange, but whatever. And I want to talk about why this idea has such a stranglehold on the minds of so many gamers and so many Nintendo fans. Before we dive any deeper into today's Switch 2 topic, I like to remind you guys I'm always trying to grow the channel here on Rule of Two Review. I am slowly but surely closing in on 20,000 subscribers, and man, I really hope that I hit that this year in 2022. Things are slow going. I won't lie, things have slowed down a little bit, and that's okay. But I'm hoping things might pick up a little bit, and I'd love to hit 20K this year. I upload every single week, and I talk about all things Nintendo and all things gaming, so as you watch this video, if you seem to like what I'm doing and what you hear, then I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. So while I think I'm probably going to fail at this, I actually don't want to continue to repeat a lot of the same ideas about the Switch 2 that I've already said in plenty of videos and live streams over the past 2 years, as well as a video a week or so ago where I talked about this, right? I'm going to try to not repeat too many beats, but I'm sure I'm destined to do it in some ways. But like I said, this is really more about why people seem so focused on the idea of new Switch hardware or new Nintendo hardware of any kind. And I think for the most part, it should be pretty obvious, I think, to most people. And I think that maybe seeing so many other people be kind of frustrated or upset about the fact that people talk about this as part of what also motivated me to do this, I feel like it's worth exploring and explaining to a lot of folks why this topic keeps coming up. Not just from me, but even from other people now in the wake of Zelda's delay. And that obvious reason is just the fact that new hardware from any company, especially if it's maybe your favorite company like Nintendo, if they're your favorite company, that's always exciting. New hardware, a new generation, more power from XYZ company, seeing our favorite franchises get that power and graphical boost that we've been dreaming about for so long, that by default is just an exciting concept. Let alone the other most obvious fact that so many people for some reason are in denial about, which is that the Switch, as great as it is, and as much as I love it, it is my favorite platform on the market right now, the thing is old, man. It's just old. It released over 5 years ago, which means the tech inside of it is probably 7 or 8 or so years old, right? And I mean, that's normal. We're basically at the point where it feels normal for any console within its life cycle to start to feel its age and show its age and eventually need to move itself on to the next better, more improved version of itself, okay? That like 5 to 6 or 7 year sort of window is the ideal lifespan for most consoles, and almost every single console has had that, including Nintendo's console. When you look at the Wii or the Wii U or the Super Nintendo, I mean, this is just how these things tend to happen. And so here we are in year 6 of the Switch's life, and it is selling incredibly well. So that's the one element that does make things a little bit shaky here. But I think that in year 6, and in a world where the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X are also now out there, and we're seeing more and more great, beautiful games coming out in 4K, that just look fantastic and that just could never run on the Switch, it's now pushing more and more folks to realize, okay, Switch is great, it's amazing for what it was 5 years ago, and yeah, it's still selling, but it's time to move on to something more powerful. We want to see Nintendo take that next step in the power and the graphics game, and that's a normal, acceptable, completely okay, I think at least, for gamers and game fans and Nintendo fans to want and to desire and to ask our favorite company, in this case Nintendo, to look at doing. And so yes, PS5, Series X, year 6 of the Switch, games that can't run on the Switch, I mean, all of these things make it so that we're all kind of getting ready to see Nintendo finally move on to a next generation of their own hardware. At this point in 2022, I don't think it's crazy for a lot of us to want to see games like Elden Ring or Cyberpunk, even though I know it's buggy, but still, Elden Ring, Cyberpunk, or Red Dead Redemption 2, or Redemption 3 for that matter, whenever the Elder Scrolls 6 finally releases. All these different games and franchises, these multi-platform games, we want to be able to see these games also have their own fair shot on Nintendo's current hardware, because that's only a benefit to any given piece of hardware that they can release on, okay? And that's just talking about the third-party multi-platform stuff. I, of course, am well aware that the Switch has done a fantastic job of some great third-party exclusive content, right? Like Bayonetta 3, which is coming up sometime in the future, like Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, like Octopath Traveler, that for a while was exclusive, and Astral Chain, and so many other wonderful games. Yes, it gets some great third-party exclusive stuff, but that third-party multi-platform stuff, it does matter, and it will matter more and more in the future. And so Nintendo needs to consider that stuff moving forward. Yes, it's still selling well, and it's breaking those records, like I said, without the extreme power and without a lot of these third-party multi-platform games, absolutely. But that won't last forever. So it's not about looking at the right now, just what's happening today, and saying everything's fine because today it's doing okay. It's about also being one step ahead of the game, one step ahead of the competition, preparing for the future, preparing for a sea change in whatever's happening in the industry. And Nintendo, as much as they can be successful doing their own thing and ignoring some parts of the industry, they can't ignore all of it. And they can't pretend like that protective shield they've had around themselves will last forever. A great example is the ill-fated Wii U, which you guys know I love to death. But that was an example where Nintendo made mistakes, they didn't predict properly what was going to happen in the industry, and all of these factors I'm talking about now that they did do correctly with the Switch were things they didn't do correctly with the Wii U. And again, even though I think it's a great piece of hardware, it was a huge sales failure. And it was a huge money sink and a loss of revenue for Nintendo. And that didn't really do well for them. And so in order to help, in my opinion, in order to help prevent a repeat of the Wii U, Nintendo needs to plan ahead and they need to do it properly. And this is all a very long-winded way for me to say, I think Nintendo preparing for and releasing newer, more powerful hardware that can be a little bit more competitive with PS5 and Series X, and hopefully be able to get a lot of these third-party multi-platform games while also boosting the quality of their first-party games. Doing that in the next year or so is probably the right call for them moving forward. And again, because of people's reactions to delaying Zelda and Nintendo's history of Zelda games and launching titles, and also, 2 instances of cross-gen Zelda launches for new hardware at those given times, we're just seeing people realize a lot of what I'm kind of spending this video talking to you about, right? All of these reasons and justifications that I'm word vomiting out to you guys about why the next Switch or next gen hardware makes sense next year is stuff that people are finally starting to realize. And yeah, it took the delay of Zelda, I think, to get a lot of people to realize these things, whereas I've already kind of seen this coming for 2 years. I think it's interesting and worth noting that these are okay things for people to desire, for more power from Nintendo, and for more third-party multi-platform games to release on the Nintendo platform of choice that they want to play on. It's okay to do that. And it's also okay to acknowledge that eventually the Switch's goodwill and great sales will run out. It's not like an attack on your favorite plastic box company, Nintendo, okay? And again, they are my favorite company too. But when people get so defensive, these kinds of things come out, and they take things so personally. And don't do that. Don't take a criticism or a critique or an analysis of Nintendo's business or any company's business as a personal attack on you and your fanship of that company. That's really silly, man. And we see so many people react that way, and it just is, it's very disheartening. I think it's an immature response, regardless of someone's age, because I've seen people who are very much well into their adulthood still having these immature responses. And we don't need to do that. It's okay to acknowledge that maybe Nintendo needs to look at changing their Switch model going forward. Then we get into the time-tested defense of, Kimishima and Nintendo have said that, the Switch is only halfway through its life cycle, which they've said for 2 or 3 years in a row, by the way. So at what point is the halfway period over? So there's that kind of ridiculous thing. There's also, very famously last year, they had an investors call where they showed and featured a slide that confirmed next-gen hardware that they're already working on. They didn't talk about it in detail. They're not trying to repeat the mistakes they made with confirming the Nintendo NX back in 2014, but they did basically say, yeah, obviously the thing that's going to come after the Switch, that's already a plan, we're already working on it. And then if we more further dive into the halfway through the life cycle thing, I think that there's a couple of ways that we can come at that showcases why a Switch 2 may still be in the cards for next year. One of them is what I've already said in the past to you, which is that if they release something called a Switch 2 or a Super Switch Plus or whatever it is, that's a Switch title in the Switch family, but that's also offering next-gen capability and power, whether it's called a sequel or whether it's called a Pro, if it's next-gen capable, that's capable of playing games that the current Switch can't play, and especially if it's backwards compatible, which I would expect it would be, then I would argue that you could call that part of the 10-year Switch game plan. Because the Switch family, whether it's current Switch or Switch OLED or Switch 2 or Switch Pro, it's all part of the Switch family that might be lasting 10 to 15 years. So that could be part of what they mean when they say halfway through the life cycle. The other thing, which blows my mind that so many people haven't considered this, despite the fact that I've been saying it for a long time, is that if we pretend a Switch 2 or their next hardware, whatever it is, launches next year, the Switch itself as we know it won't just die and immediately go away as soon as that happens. Nintendo will continue to make Switches, they will continue to sell Switches, and they will continue to probably support the Switch with software for many years into the life of their next console. The same way they did with the Wii, the same way Sony is doing with the PlayStation 4 right now, by the way. We know they're supporting the PlayStation 4 at least into 2023. And the PlayStation 5 came out in 2020, so there's a 3-year overlap right there. Who's to say that the Switch won't also have a 3-year overlap into the life cycle of the next console, right? And so again, that means that feasibly Nintendo might be supporting and making Switches up until 2025 or 26 or 27, but that next-gen console, or that Switch 2, could still release in 2023, many years before they stop actually making and supporting the Switch. Like, it's not a crazy concept. There's precedent in the industry from other companies to do that. There's precedent for Nintendo themselves to do the same thing. But people, and in my experience, it's mostly the younger people who are less experienced, but many people just seem to have a total mental blockage when it comes to that idea. And it's like, we have to just consider these things and acknowledge that most people understand the truth of this. And I think that's why many people, again, including myself, understand that Zelda or no Zelda, Nintendo is probably considering these things and might be releasing a new Switch or a new piece of hardware in the next year or two. And so as I kind of wind this down and wrap this conversation up here, it's one of those videos where I'm now reflective on the last 20 or so minutes, and I know that this probably came off as one of my more lecturing type of videos. I know the energy and the way I'm discussing this might have that kind of vibe to it. Every once in a while, I get so passionate about an angle that I believe in. I know that sometimes my conversations maybe come off that way. And I mean, I'm not trying to lecture people, but I do certainly get frustrated by some people's lack of logic or lack of understanding. And I also so very much believe in this that, yes, I'm very passionate about how I'm talking about why I think it makes sense for Nintendo to be looking at next gen soon, and why so many other people are jumping on board, like I said, in many cases because of the delay of Zelda. And the delay of Zelda may not even end up having an impact, by the way. But I think it's just worth noting that that's what pushed a lot of people over the edge, and we keep seeing Switch 2 trending, we keep seeing people talk about it on Twitter, we keep seeing YouTube videos from people who are finally not me, by the way. I've been doing it for 2 years, and now other people are jumping on board and realizing this is the time frame that we're probably going to see Nintendo move on to new hardware. And as I've said before, I have given a hard cutoff, a hard prediction of when I think they will do it, which is in 2023, okay? So if it happens in 2024 or later, my predictions will have been wrong. But I just think it's interesting to see a lot of people start to hop on board with this conversation, okay? And maybe this is all wrong. Here's the thing. What if we're wrong? What if I'm wrong? What if all these other people are wrong? And Nintendo really is going to wait until 2027? Think about that year really hard in your brains right now. What if Nintendo is waiting until 2027 to release any sort of new hardware and a power jump? I mean, at that point, we'll be looking at PS6 and Xbox Series Y, whatever they're going to call it. I mean, literally, Sony and Microsoft, by the time 2027 rolls around, will probably themselves be looking at their next consoles. And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think that's just absolutely impossible and not going to happen. But people do still think that, and so maybe that is going to happen. I don't know. Anyway, I feel like I'm a little all over the place in this video, and I know I've been very passionate about explaining why I believe what I believe, and why I think other people are finally starting to believe it as well. But it's an interesting conversation, and I think that folks need to stop getting so defensive about Nintendo and the Switch, and they need to stop acting like seeing people talk about a Switch 2 in the next year or two is an affront or an attack on the Switch itself. Like, that's not what these conversations are, man. Those of us who are older and wiser and more experienced in the gaming industry than a lot of the younger folks and the kids out there who are getting upset about these things, we know that this is just the normal course of a video game console's life cycle. This is the life. This is just the way things go, and it's been very, I'm going to admit it, very frustrating to see people maybe not realize that and push back against it with no real merit. So anyway, I think I've rambled long enough about this. Like I said, I know I'm all over the place here, but it's an interesting topic, and I wanted to defend all those other people who are starting to talk about the Switch 2 coming out in the next year or two, because I agree with them. And I think that what those people are seeing and saying is stuff that I also agree with, and I think it makes sense logically. Maybe we get proven wrong, but in the here and now, with the information that we do have and the delay of Zelda, yes, it makes sense to think that maybe new Switch hardware is coming out next year. So Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. I'll be very curious to see the reaction. I could see people going a couple different ways. Maybe I catch a lot of flack for this video. Maybe I convince people and a lot of you guys start to understand where I'm coming from. Either way, that's what I have to say. Discuss your own thoughts on this topic below. And with that, this video is a wrap. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of Two Review, and I will catch you next time on another video. Bye-bye.